On the last episode of the Keepsake box, I told Ken that we needed to talk, and he agreed. Well, that was unexpected. I assumed that I would dictate the direction of the conversation, but he started talking right away. Ken started by apologizing and telling me that I was the most important person in his life. He didn't know it, but I was already sold on his apology. Nonetheless, I allowed him to continue. Ken started crying, just as he had when I found out about Melanie. He told me that he was going through a lot at home, and he was sorry to have taken it out on me. He told me that both of his parents had been arrested in a drug bust a few weeks prior, and he recently found out that things weren't looking good for them. I asked Ken why he hadn't told me about what he was going through, and he said that he wanted me to concentrate on school instead of worrying about his situation, as he knew I would. According to Ken, he was stressed out. Consequently, he'd had too much to drink and smoked some marijuana, and that made sense in my mind. I didn't know what marijuana smelled like, but I was very much aware that Ken smelled different the night before. His explanation gave me what I needed, a valid reason to stay with him. The person from the night prior wasn't my Ken. He was alternate Ken. Alternate Ken was the mean Ken that was affected by pain, drugs, and alcohol, but my Ken wouldn't ever hurt me. The answer was simple. All I had to do was keep him happy and sober, right? Ken turned to face me. He had tears in his eyes. Baby, if you give me one more chance, I promise to never hurt you again. He told me that he knew he didn't deserve it, but he was begging me to forgive him, and I don't have to tell you that I did. Ken opened his trunk and retrieved a Polaroid camera. Let's take a picture, he said. I was ecstatic. We took a few pictures and Ken divided them between us. He reached into the trunk again. That time, he retrieved a box. What's this? I asked. It's a keepsake box. You can keep special things inside. I couldn't have known the extreme role that keepsake box would end up playing in my life. I opened the box and there was a smaller box inside. Upon opening that box, I found that there was a ring inside. Ken took the ring from the box and slid it onto my right ring finger. He told me that it was a promise ring. He explained that it was a symbol of his promise to love and protect me for as long as he was alive. He told me that the ring connected us forever. I promised to love and protect him forever and to always be his, another thing that will play an extreme role in our lives. That moment imprinted him on my heart, and that promise followed me forever. Chapter 19, Can't Hide. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. Ken and I became extremely close after the promise. Our conversations became deeper, and our relationship was much more intense than any relationship between 16 and 18-year-olds should ever have been. I ate, slept, and breathed with Ken in my mind, and he seemed to do the same. As fall made its exit, I learned quite a bit about Ken. He had suffered many hardships for a boy of his age. Ken opened up about seeing his older brother get killed. He cried about his parents and their struggles with drugs. They seemed to alternate between being drug dealers and drug users, mostly the latter. We shared some of our deepest secrets. I often got close to telling Ken about Ron, but I always lost my nerve at the last minute. That was not to be the case on a cold day in December. Things really do have a way of letting themselves out of the boxes that we try to keep closed. I awakened that morning, and it felt like every other day. It was a Thursday. I got dressed and went into the kitchen to make breakfast. Mom and Cassidy had already left for the day. Ron was sitting at the table drinking his morning coffee and reading the newspaper. Something was wrong. I could tell. Is everything okay? I asked. No, said Ron. Nothing is okay. I immediately regretted asking, and I decided not to press the issue. But without being further prompted, Ron decided to elaborate. Your mom is pregnant again. I was shocked. Cassidy was 4, and it was becoming apparent that there was something wrong with her. She was developmentally behind, and she still didn't speak well. Mom seemed to have a hard time dealing with Cassidy. I never expected her to get pregnant again. I thought back to how things were when Mom was pregnant. I also thought about how hard it was for me to care for Cassidy on a daily basis. I couldn't imagine adding another baby to the mix. I wanted to cry. I was trapped in my thoughts when I heard Ron yelling, "Londa, do you hear me?" I looked up and realized that he was standing in front of me. He looked angry. Ron started yelling about how he was already broke and how Mom had gone and gotten pregnant, as if he had played no part in the process. Ron grabbed me by my arms and started shaking me. He screamed that he was already struggling and that there would soon be another mouth to feed. I stood quietly, as I didn't know what to say. I guess my lack of response bothered Ron. He started hitting me and he pushed me onto the floor. I cowered there, waiting for him to grow tired, but he wasn't tired. He started kicking me and I had no other choice but to take it. Ron stopped to catch his breath. In that moment, I was presented with an opportunity and I took it. I jumped off of the floor and made a mad dash towards the door. I ran to the bus stop where Ken was already waiting. I couldn't hide the situation any longer. My nose was bloody and I was noticeably disheveled. "What happened to you?" Ken screamed. "Just drive," I said. Ken started driving and we went in the opposite direction of my school. I wanted to ask where we were going, but I couldn't stop crying for a long enough period to do so. He drove for approximately 10 minutes before arriving at a small white house in town. I looked over to Ken, who motioned for me to follow him inside. Ken unlocked the door, and we walked down a short hall that led to a living room. It was small, but appropriately furnished and comfortable. Looking around, I knew it was Ken's house. There were pictures of him and who I presumed were his parents. There were also pictures of him and his older brother, who was killed years earlier. Even though his parents were incarcerated, I felt strange being there, like I was about to get caught doing something wrong. I sat on the couch and Ken sat beside me. By that time, I had composed myself enough to explain what was going on. I started from the beginning and told Ken about my situation with Ron. Well, I didn't tell him everything, not initially. I told him about the verbal and physical abuse, but I didn't mention the touching. Ken sat quietly for a moment before turning to face me. I now recognized the look he had as the calm before the storm. Ken was very quiet and deliberate in his speech, but he had tears in his eyes. The veins in his forehead looked as if they were about to break through. Seeing the face made me nervous about what was to come. Ken took my hand and looked squarely into my eyes. "Baby, has he ever touched you? Sexually?" I paused for a brief moment, and that was all it took. Ken started knocking things off the table. He started screaming that he was going to kill Ron. I stood and tried to calm him down, but he pushed me onto the couch and continued his rant. I sat for a few moments, wondering how to approach Ken. I again attempted to regain some control of the situation. "We never had sex," I screamed. Ken paused for a moment and asked me to repeat myself. I told him that I would explain everything if he would agree to sit and listen. Ken sat and I explained everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I told him about Ron kissing me when I was 12 and about him attempting to insert his finger into me, resulting in me locking my bedroom door at night. I looked at Ken. We were both crying. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I explained that it wasn't the type of thing you want to tell someone. "I'm not someone," he said. "I'm Ken. I'm your Ken." He told me that he hadn't taken it lightly when he promised to love and protect me forever. I apologized and told him that I wouldn't ever keep anything from him again. He hugged me and told me that everything would be okay. Ken looked into my eyes and addressed me. "You need anything, baby?" I asked if he had any pain relievers. "You got a headache?" he asked. I wanted to agree to the headache, but I had just promised not to hide anything from him. I stood and removed my shirt. Although I hadn't seen the damage to my torso, if the bruises were anything like the ones on my arms, I knew they would be pretty bad. Ken walked around me, touching my body like an inquisitive child at a zoo. Along with the bruises that were visible to me, Ken pointed out several large bruises on my back as well. Ken took my hand and led me into a bedroom. He retrieved a t-shirt and some sweatpants from a drawer. "Put these on," he said. I removed my jeans, exposing more bruises on my butt and thighs. I again saw the calm before the storm. Ken grabbed my hand, and I told him that everything was going to be okay. Disregarding my words of comfort, Ken stated that Ron had to pay for what he'd done. I chalked it up to anger and decided not to put a lot of stock into what he was saying. Ken left the room while I was getting dressed. He returned with 2 pills and a glass of water. "Lie down and get some rest," he said. I climbed into bed and took the pills that Ken gave me. I didn't ask what they were. I trusted him. Not more than 10 minutes later, I began to feel incredibly drowsy. "What did you give me?" I asked. Ken never answered. He held my hand and watched me drift into unconsciousness. It was not yet 9 o'clock. When I awakened, I felt as if I had been asleep for days, yet I was still tired. Stepping off of the bed, I was alerted to the fact that my legs were incredibly heavy. I called Ken's name as I made my rounds from room, to no avail. I scanned the driveway for Ken's car. It wasn't there. I looked back at the clock and realized that it was just after 1 o'clock. I had 2 hours before I would be expected home, and I didn't know how things were going to play out with Ron. Feeling anxious and worried, I decided to busy myself while Ken was gone. I washed the dishes that were left in the sink and decided to make dinner for Ken. Surely he would appreciate a good meal since his mom was in jail. There wasn't much food in the house, but I managed to put something together. Chicken wings, mac and cheese, and peas. A good solid dinner. Ken arrived just as I was taking the last batch of chicken out of the grease. "You got it smelling good in here, girl." That's what he said to me. I smiled. Ken kissed me and asked why I wasn't resting. I told him that I had awakened and decided to cook him a good dinner before returning home. "Home?" he exclaimed. "You can't go back there." I didn't have a choice. I was 16. Mom and Ron wouldn't ever agree to let me move out, especially not with a boy. I could tell that Ken was bothered, but he knew I had a valid point. Instead of pressing further, he asked if I was going to eat dinner with him. I nodded yes. Ken retrieved 2 plates from the cabinet and walked towards the stove. "What are you doing?" I asked. He told me that he was fixing our plates. "That's nonsense," I said. "No man should ever have to make his own plate." Ken looked confused, but he deviated and sat at the table. I made his plate and delivered his silverware, napkin, and tea, all before I made my own plate. I retrieved salt, pepper, and hot sauce and asked if he needed anything else. "No, baby," he said. I made a plate for myself and sat down to enjoy the meal. Ken finished eating before I did. Instinctively, I stopped eating to gather his dishes and put them into the standing dishwater. Ken never said a word. He silently watched me eat. After I completed my meal, I washed the dishes and put everything away. Now, before you object to my behavior, you need to understand something. I was trained. Of course, Ron set the stage for me to be his personal servant, but I was trained long before he entered into the picture. Years of Christian worship had taught me to be subservient to men. The man was to lead and the woman was to follow. A woman must submit to her man. That felt very natural to me. It was all I knew. Many people who had never stepped foot in a church quoted the Bible when explaining why it was important for women to be submissive to men. As I began to get older and formulate theories of my own, I started to believe that many of those old adages came from years of women blaming themselves for the transgressions of their men and men allowing them to do so. The common thought was a man is going to be a man and a woman has to do what's necessary to keep him. That was the mindset back then, and most women bought into it, myself included. Ken walked over to me as I was cleaning. He put his arms around me and asked if I was absolutely sure that I wanted to go home. He kissed me, making it harder for me to resist his offer. "You know I have to go," I said. Ken took my hand and led me into the living room. On the couch were several bags filled with clothing and toiletries. "What's this?" I asked. Ken told me that there were things for me to keep there in case I changed my mind. He passed me a key and told me that I could come there at any time. Ken wasn't without his faults. but I couldn't be convinced that he didn't love me. I knew he did, but that was a large part of the problem. We loved much too intensely for our ages. Love makes people do crazy things under the best of circumstances. Add anger, impulsivity, and immaturity to that equation, and it usually doesn't end well. Ken and I were no exception. I changed back into my clothes, and Ken drove me towards the direction of my house. I was hoping that Ron had drank too much and passed out, as he often did. We arrived at the bus stop. Ken stopped me before I exited. He told me that he loved me and to page him if I needed him. I'll always be there for you, I promise. That's what he said to me. There was something in Ken's expression that I couldn't place at the time. Perhaps it was sadness. To this day, I wish I had said something more, but I simply told him that I loved him and exited the vehicle. I didn't know it at the time, but the next time I saw Ken, it would be under very different circumstances. I made the short walk to the house, and even walking slowly, I arrived much too quickly. Great. Ron's truck wasn't there. Maybe he would be out until Mom arrived, making another confrontation less likely. I changed into a long-sleeve shirt and sweatpants, and I started preparing dinner for the night. Chicken wings, mac and cheese, and peas. Only because the meal reminded me of Ken. Midway through preparation, I heard the sound of keys jingling at the door. I expected to only see Ron, but to my surprise, Ron, Mom, and Cassidy were all walking through the door. It wasn't yet 4 o'clock. Mom wasn't due home for another 2 hours, but that was the least shocking part of the equation. Ron had obviously been injured and he was barely able to walk. He was holding his ribs and he had bruises all over his face. One of his eyes was completely swollen shut. "Oh my goodness," I exclaimed. "What happened?" Mom motioned for me to follow her into the kitchen. She told me that Ron had been attacked by someone while he was getting the mail. I was shocked, as those types of things didn't happen in the country. Though Mom told me not to worry. She said that the police had a lead and they would be arresting the perpetrator very soon. I was relieved. For as much as I disliked Ron, the last thing I wanted was a random attacker roaming the streets. I was still really upset with Ron, but I kind of felt sorry for him. I made plates for everyone. Although I wasn't hungry, I pulled a Mom and pretended to eat a little. Suddenly, Mom sprang from her seat and ran to the bathroom. Oh yeah! In all the commotion, I had forgotten that Mom was pregnant. That was the catalyst for Ron's early morning breakdown. Of course, Ron limped behind Mom, which gave me an excellent opportunity to throw my food away without being detected. I cleared Mom's plate and started washing the dishes. I wanted to pretend to be concerned about Mom, but all I could think about was the laugh that Ken and I would get about Ron's attack. I never saw Mom again that night. It was day 1 of her pregnancy and she was already back up to her old antics. She went to her bedroom, leaving me to cater to Ron and Cassidy. After cleaning, I got Cassidy ready for bed and retreated to my bedroom for the remainder of the night. I couldn't wait to tell Ken the story of how Ron came limping into the house. I paged Ken all night long. He never called me back. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon. I sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.